Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex. As always, we are here to talk with people who were on the ground in Mobile and was in Texas. I don't know exactly where in Texas for the Shrine Bowl, but we were here to talk about some guys who watched the prospects live, get into a little bit of draft talk. This part of the season. Here with me is Alex and Gavino. Gavino, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. It's good to be back on the show. It's been a full year, but seems just
Yeah,
like yesterday.
I know. And the season just kind of went by like that. And someone who's also been covering the show here on our channel, Alex, how's it been going?
Pretty good. Had to unpack my mic in order to do the show today because I haven't unpacked from getting home. But everything's going good. Lots of exciting stuff going on.
So just general Chargers offseason stuff to start. I guess, how do you sort of gauge how aggressive they are going to be in free agency leading into the draft, in terms of getting into the specific prospects we're going to kind of talk about that impressed. What are some of the moves and how aggressive do you gauge that they'll be heading into that draft process?
Alex.
Yeah, so I think that they're probably going to be less aggressive than people are maybe hoping for. I don't necessarily think that like a huge signing at wide receiver is inbound. I don't necessarily think that a huge trade at wide receiver is inbound either, at least from what we've heard so far. Obviously, with the combine at the end of this month, we'll kind of get a lot more of that intel about like how the offseason is going to kind of shape up. But I think that in general, sort of what we've been talking about since the season ended of like kind of take a middle tier free agent at wide receiver and draft one a little bit earlier and then spend that money on the offensive line, especially on the interior where the free agent class is a little bit stronger. I still think that that's probably the way that they're going to lean. Defensively, I think that a lot of, like this defensive line class is fantastic in the draft. And so, does that change at all how you approach re-signing guys like Poona Ford and Tier Tart? Maybe, right? Obviously, corner is going to be a position that like is going to kind of be circled maybe a little bit further down the list for them. But I think, from being on the ground this last week or so, you kind of get the sense that like there's a lot of defensive talent and there's a lot of talent at running back and at tight end. And so the Chargers don't necessarily need to be super aggressive in those areas.
Yeah. I think Alex pretty much said everything. I think, a lot of people believe the Chargers are going to be aggressive in free agency given, the cap space that they have and think like, we're going to sign the T. Higgins and, we're going to get this top tier, we're going to get Trey Smith and all that. But I don't think that that's the case. Again, like you said, the draft is filled with good defensive tackles. So how they approach Poona Ford, Tier Tart, it's fine because the draft class is good. And I feel like there's other positions in this draft class that could really, play a part and sway them away from free agency and making a move, that route. So,
is there, I guess, kind of what is the perception of this draft class? Because I feel like we went into last year where it was considered a very stacked draft class, particularly at wide receiver early on. And then, you had a lot of premium offensive talent kind of across the board in that draft. This draft, I think, you've seen stuff leak out about how many true first round grades are there, and sort of the depth of the class. And I guess maybe the top of the class not being as strong compared to last year based off of what you saw at, Shrine and Senior Bowl. Is that did that narrative, I guess, pan out for you, or, did it sort of challenge some of your assertions?
I would say so. I think that a lot of the guys that we have sort of assumed are going to be the top guys in this draft class didn't necessarily participate in either all-star game. Most of the guys that are expected to go like top 15 or something, a guy like Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren at tight end, both declined to participate in both events. But you saw someone like Mike Green, who's an edge that we've been talking about out of Marshall for a long time, really pop at the Senior Bowl. And, so there's always going to be some movement like that. Like Gray Zabel, the North Dakota State offensive lineman, is another guy at the Senior Bowl that really popped. But I think for the most part, I think that the narrative does hold up, that like the top of this draft is not necessarily as strong, but I do think that there's a pretty clear delineation between like the top 15 to 20 or so. And then from 20 to 60-ish, you kind of have a bunch of guys where it's just going to depend on scheme fit and on culture fit and everything like that, where it's, every team is going to have those 40 guys ranked differently, which is not necessarily super uncommon, but I think that like those guys are a lot closer together than in previous years. And so I do think that like sitting at 22, you are sort of at the beginning of that section, right? And so if you want to try to make a move down for someone, right? Like if another team is really in love with one of these guys that they have like top 20 or, one of their first round grades is still left, maybe you can try to make a move down. But the thing about making a move down always is that there has to be a team that wants to move up. And with a class that's so packed kind of between 20 and 60, I don't necessarily know that there's going to be a guy like that, or that there's going to be an offer like that for the Chargers to take.
Yeah, I feel like this class is pretty interesting because, it's not like top heavy. Like you have your top guys and all that, but I feel like it's really going to separate who these good like evaluators are in terms of like GMs and all that. Because it's like the day 3 picks. That's where it's kind of just like, okay, you have some decent guys, but like Alex said, it's like, okay, like where are they going to fit scheme wise and all that. And that's why I think this class is polarizing in that sense, is like, all right, we're going to have the good GMs separate themselves from like the bad GMs, and very like depth heavy in a sense, like compared to other classes, I believe.
Yeah, Alex just brought up trading down, which, is something in previous years we had like tried to kind of like beg the Chargers to do at certain points. And so maybe it does have a chance to happen in this draft if there is some kind of suitor there, or if some of the names the Chargers kind of want, like Colston Loveland, for example, are off the board by 22. So I guess this brings us into defensive talent. Let's start there first, and we'll get to the offensive guys later. You brought up cornerback earlier, I think, and that's a position that I think is really interesting for the Chargers. Maybe stuff that the fan base isn't necessarily talking about, because they did get the rookie years that they wanted from, for the most part, from Cam Hart, from Tarheeb Still. And I think that position is seen as kind of on stable ground, regardless of, what necessarily happens with Christian Fulton, as well as Asante Samuel Jr. But going into this draft, you do have Tarheeb, who's going to probably have a starting role, and then Cam Hart, who kind of struggled to stay on the field this year with injuries. Where do you kind of gauge them adding at cornerback in this draft? And then I guess where are a couple names or, round range where you sort of see, potential fits?
Yeah, I think the main thing you're going to be looking for at corner, to me, is you want to grab a guy that's going to be CB1 going forward, right? Where like, I think that towards the end of the season, when Christian Fulton and Cam Hart both got a little bit healthier, I think that you saw that despite Tarheeb's play and the fact that he just got a first place vote for Defensive Rookie of the Year earlier this evening, the Chargers are more comfortable putting him in the slot. And I think that's going to be his long-term spot. I think that he played on the outside kind of because he had to, with Fulton and Asante and Cam and Dean Leonard all injured, basically, right? And so you put him in the slot long-term. You're hoping that Hart kind of works out the health stuff and is able to cement himself as maybe a CB1 candidate, but at the very minimum, a CB2 on the outside. But then really like there's kind of a hole at the top of that depth chart, right? Where you're still looking for like the elite shutdown guy. And so to me, I think that corner is going to be in consideration in round 1. I don't necessarily know that it's going to be the pick. I don't necessarily know that it's going to be the best pick, but there are a lot of guys that are going to kind of be available in that 22-ish range that I think would make a lot of sense for the Chargers. Savon Revel, who was at the Shrine Bowl just doing interviews, he didn't participate as he's recovering from a torn ACL, is one of those guys out of East Carolina. He played against Jim Harbaugh's Michigan squad in 2023, and so they've seen him before, and they kind of know what he's about. I think a guy like Azariah Thomas from Florida State, who was at the Senior Bowl, is someone that could jump into that spot depending on how well he tests at the combine. There's a few guys like that I think are going to be available sort of in the first round. If you want to wait until day 2, there's plenty of options there too. I really like Kobe Bryant from Kansas. He's a little bit thinner, a little bit smaller, but like he's going to be able to play on the outside. He's got the physicality to do it. And so, you can kind of find a guy at every point in the draft at corner for the Chargers. But it's just going to be a matter of how confident they are in Hart's ability to stay healthy and rise to the player that he kind of showed that he could be when he was healthy, and also what they want to do with still long-term, which again, I think is putting him in the slot. But the Chargers may feel differently after, going back and watching the tape from the season.
Yeah, one guy that Alex didn't say that I've loved, for the longest time is Jahdae Barron from Texas. I feel like he's pretty versatile inside-out player. I think Daniel Jeremiah had him like 14, so he's definitely starting to generate even more buzz, but he's a first-round corner that I really like for them. Then you have, Notre Dame, like Benjamin Morrison, like depending on like how healthy he is, like that's another guy who could be, first, second round. But like you said, they definitely need CB1, so it makes you wonder like how they would approach free agency with that. It remains to be seen if Fulton or Samuel are going to be back. But again, that's a need that I feel like we're not talking about as much. That could be potential round 1 consideration.
As we were just talking, Antonio Gates just got nominated to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, which is very, very cool.
Still a year too late, but
I know, still a year too late. Like he had the most touchdowns of all time and didn't get in. The very, very fickle voters. That's just crazy stuff. But getting into this class a little bit more, we just talked about. At one point, I did want to bring up about corner. We did have Adam Fuller, who did get hired as the safeties coach. Obviously, some thought there as to Azariah Thomas or any of the Florida State defensive talent that maybe he could bring on board, sort of in the way that we saw from Mike Elston as well as Chris O'Leary last year. So I know FSU's defense was not, the house it was last year. But as someone like Azaria, who was in the Senior Bowl, you think he's probably someone that's under kind of consideration there?
Yeah, I would expect so. I think that a lot of the influence that a guy like Fuller is going to have is probably going to be on the UDFA signings. So like if you look at like the way that Chris O'Leary affected like their signing of Thomas Harper right at the end of the draft last year, or like the way that the Chargers kind of attacked the defensive line and the DB room with the Michigan connection in UDFA last year. I think that that's going to be sort of more where you see a lot of that influence shine, especially given the talent that Florida State has in the secondary kind of coming out this year. There are a couple of guys that are going to kind of be in that range. I think Fentrell Cypress is a guy who was like the CB2 at Florida State. I think he's probably going to be a late rounder or UDFA. And so if he does make it to UDFA, I would probably expect him to at least heavily consider signing with the Chargers. But I think that that's probably more where the influence is going to lie, more than like a safeties coach that's been, that's like the one new coach on staff, like pounding the table for like, we're going to take a guy in the first round because I said so. Of course, like, if they go to Adam Fuller and he's like, I don't want Azariah Thomas, he's a head case, right? Or something. And like, we don't know, right? Like all that stuff behind the scenes, right? Like we don't know what goes on there, but that could, affect their decision to not take him. But I think that that's more likely than their decision to take a guy like that early. And anyone that they do take, like I said, I think is more going to be like a day 3 or UDFA guy where Fuller kind of stands up and says like, hey, this is a guy that I think fits the culture.
I feel like Joshua Farmer falls under that too. Defensive tackle from Florida State.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And getting into the rest of the defensive talent in this draft, who were some of the other guys that stood out to you? I know you mentioned Mike Green, who obviously generated a lot of buzz this week. Who are some of the maybe Chargers fits that you saw kind of at Senior Bowl and Shrine Bowl on the defensive side of the ball?
Yeah, I think the first one that comes to mind is CJ West, the Indiana defensive tackle. He was one of the best players at the Shrine Bowl, period, like regardless of position, regardless of draft status. I have heard that he is expecting like top 125, so like third or fourth round. But I think, if you want to add a body to that room that doesn't necessarily come at the cost of a first round pick, right? That doesn't come at the cost of necessarily replacing Poona Ford and Tier Tart outright in year one. Excuse me. I think that he makes a lot of sense there. Someone like Tyler Batty at the Senior Bowl or at the Shrine Bowl, was really impressive. He's a little bit on the older side. I think he's probably going to be more of a late round guy, but someone to potentially add in the edge room. On the senior side, obviously Mike Green was the best player there. Darius Alexander at Toledo. I know Steven watched him recently, but he was completely dominant on the inside. I think that he's sort of catapulted himself into like early day 2 consideration. So probably like a second or third round pick. Again, if you want to add some pass rush juice on the inside, I think that he's a great option. Great route to go for that. But those are kind of like the main guys focusing like on the defensive trenches there that I noticed at least.
So CJ West was mentioned by Alex, another defensive tackle that was probably the best player there. Jordan Phillips out of Maryland. So he was unblockable in one-on-ones. He showed a lot. So quick first step, big time power, getting his hands inside. I wish it showed up more consistently on tape, like when I watched him. But again, he was a force. He's likely going to be, say, like top 75, top 100 pick based on his showing. Staying along the defensive line, I really liked Elijah Roberts, the edge rusher from SMU. So he came in at 6'3", 290, pretty long arms. For being that size, he's pretty quick and twitchy, but he obviously had a lot of power, walking blockers back. And he's just one of those guys that's pretty versatile. So he could play a wide 9 and then reduce inside on passing downs. I think in his final 2 years, he had like 131 quarterback pressures and 17 sacks. So he was very productive. And then another edge that I liked was that I actually was able to talk to a little bit, Antoine Powell-Ryland. I think Alex has mentioned him before in like one of his draft shows. So average size, like 6'3", 6'2", maybe 253. Short arms though. So he's only got like 31-inch arms, but he definitely packed a punch. So he actually was a lot powerful for having short arms. But he's going to be known for more of his finesse. He has a really nice spin move, and he's quick off the snap. So those are some guys like in the trenches that I really liked. Alex, I know you're going to like this guy, Robert Longerbeam.
Yeah, I know about him.
From Rutgers. He actually was really good. So I feel like another guy, like if they're going to attack corner like late in the draft, I feel like he would be good for some depth in the slot position. So 5'11", 171 pounds. Really good in off coverage. Very scrappy player, good vision, awareness to make plays on the ball. So he really caught my eye as well.
Top 5 next gen stats speed. I think he was caught with at the Shrine Bowl. I saw that today. Right. So Rutgers legend Robert Longerbeam, as well as Rutgers legend Holland Pierce. How was he? Let me know how he was.
He was good. He's very big. He's almost too big to play football. But yeah, he was all right. I thought a couple other offensive linemen kind of outshined him a little bit. I'm sure we'll get into in a second here, but I thought he was pretty decent.
Getting into, we just mentioned some edge players. That obviously this depends on what they do with Khalil Mack, who is not retiring, but may not be back, depending on what he likes to do in unrestricted free agency, if he does hit that. And then obviously they have a very big Joey Bosa decision to make about that cap hit there. How do you kind of add to this room? Let's, I guess, assume Mack is back for a minute, but even if he's not, that could mean a higher premium, pick there certainly. How do you kind of go about the draft in terms of finding fits for either situation, sort of whether Mack is back or not, whether you're running it back with Mack and Bosa, or one or the other?
Yeah, I think that regardless of what they do with those guys at the top of the depth chart. You're looking for a guy that can add some speed, just like another dimension to kind of the pass rush room. I think that you saw with the 4 guys they had last year between Joey, Khalil, Thule, and Bud Dupree, that it was a lot of power rush. It was a lot of sort of like contained play, not necessarily a lot of, which translated right to not necessarily a lot of pressure. And so getting a guy that adds a little bit of a dynamic element, I think, is going to be the key, regardless of whether or not Bosa and Mack, or Bosa or Mack, or whatever the combination is there, comes back. And so again, I think you look at a guy like Mike Green, you look at a guy like Donovan Ezeraku at Boston College, who's about 250 pounds. Like, the Chargers are going to ask these guys to defend the run. Like, that's going to be their primary responsibility. And so anyone that like is like a strict DPR only, like cannot defend the run period, is probably not going to necessarily be in like super high consideration for them. But guys like Green or Ezeraku, or even like a Josiah Stewart, even though he came in like super tiny at the Senior Bowl, I think that those are kind of the guys that you're looking at in terms of like add a little bit of speed to the room, can still defend the run at an adequate level where you can kind of bring them in as the edge 2 or the edge 3 behind Thule and or whoever else might be back, and kind of ease them into a role where you're asking them to be a primary player for the Chargers. Obviously, if one or both of Bosa or Mack are back, that's a lot easier to do, right? Versus like if both of them are gone, then you're probably asking a rookie to play most of the snaps next to Thule, right? But I think that focusing on a guy that can add some speed to the room and kind of ease them into a role on this defense, I think that, like, as of right now, before we know what's happening with the rest of those guys, I think that's kind of the path that you have to kind of think about if you're the Chargers.
Yeah, I feel like that edge room has had like a lot of power and finesse over the past few years, and they've been missing that speed element. And Alex mentioned, like the Mike Green, the Ezeraku, Josiah Stewart. Like, there's a lot of DPRs in this class, and I'm excited to dig more into their film. Like I mentioned, Antoine Powell-Riley kind of fits under like that quick, edge rusher who can win with speed. But again, I mentioned Elijah Roberts. He's more of a power guy. I feel like there's nothing wrong with that, but they don't have that speed element. And we see like with the Nick Bonitos, and he's over there thriving in Denver, and he kind of is a smaller edge rusher, but like he's got that speed, he's got that bend. So I feel like they're missing that from the edge rusher, and it's definitely important that they bring in a guy that has that. And luckily, there are that fit that mold in this class.
Yeah, I just felt like, particularly towards the end of the season, I guess after kind of Mack was injured the first time this year, you did see a noticeable like speed gap between them and other teams in the edge room. That 3rd and 14 where you can't get CJ Stroud on the ground, and that turns into what it did in the Texans game, right? That is obviously kind of a notable play, and sort of moments where they got home with the pass rush against Houston, but not effectively enough in that regard. Let's turn it over to the offensive side of the ball, where everyone is focused, including Derwin James saying, or any receiver for the Chargers when talking about, what he's looking to add to the room. This draft is, in my estimation, not a great wide receiver draft as far as, I think there's going to be a lot of Chargers fans, as always there are on Twitter, who are going to come in with like, let's draft a guy first round, and then like all of our problems are fixed. Last year was kind of the class to do that. They obviously go with Joe Alt, which worked out really well. Then they take Ladd round 2. I don't know if you're finding a, instant impact kind of Ladd level guy in round 2 this year. And I don't know if that instant impact guy where you're going to get like a Brian Thomas in that range that the Chargers are currently at exists in round 1. What are sort of your takeaways from like how the Chargers should address the pass catchers from a wide receiver, tight end, I guess even mild like running back standpoint, in these early or late rounds of the draft?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to tell you right now that I don't think that using pick 22 on a wide receiver is going to be the best utilization of that pick. Like it's just not going to be. This draft is strongest at the top on defense, at tight end, and at running back. And so if you take a wide, like I talked about earlier, right, of like once you get to like 20 to 60, all those guys are really clustered together, right? And that includes a lot of the wide receivers, which I think runs probably from wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 11 or so in that range. I think Ted McMillan and Luther Burden are clearly wide receivers 1 and 2. Travis Hunter, if you want to include him as a wide receiver, but he's going to play corner. So, if you want to, like, those two guys are well and above everybody else. And then, like, once you get down to 22, you're looking at like Emeka Egbuka, who's slot only pretty much. Like, he can maybe play a little bit of Z, like, and do like some Robert Woodsy type stuff, but like not a wide receiver 1, at least not the way that the Chargers are envisioning, or Chargers fans rather are envisioning. Matthew Golden might be there, like kind of in that range. I would expect, it kind of sounds like he's going to go somewhere in the 20s. I don't necessarily have a good handle yet on what his fit with the Chargers is going to be, but I kind of lean sort of in a similar direction where I don't think that that's what Chargers fans are necessarily looking for out of what a round 1 wide receiver pick would be versus like you look at the talent that will probably be available around that pick, right? Where like Colston Loveland has been the most obvious mock draft pick in the first round for a number of reasons, right? Not chief among them the Michigan connection, right? But also because it makes a lot of sense, right? Like that's kind of like his ideal range. The Chargers need a tight end. He was a featured part of that offense at Michigan. Like the offense at Michigan was very structurally similar to what Greg Roman wants to do in offense. And so there's a lot of like reasons why that makes sense as a pick in the first round, more than a wide receiver does. Now, once you get into day 2 at wide receiver, there's plenty of guys. You can talk about a Trey Harris from Ole Miss. You can talk about Alec Iomanner from Stanford, Jaden Higgins from Iowa State. All guys that are going to be that outside, like vertical threat type guy that might be a little bit closer to like what fans are envisioning as a wide receiver 1. Are they going to get to that level right away? No, right? Because they're day 2 picks, right? And so you don't necessarily expect a guy like that to come in right away and make that sort of impact. But we've seen plenty of teams, and the Ravens have done this before. Obviously, like we've really been hammering that analogy ever since they hired Joe Ortiz, right? But like when a guy spends 20 years in the same front office, there's a lot to learn from that. And the Ravens have done this before, right? Where they've sort of just like taken a guy in the second, third, even a day 3 pick and turned them into a contributor, turned them into a focal point of the offense at wide receiver. And so I think that there's a lot of room in this class for the Chargers to do that, right? Because it is a weaker wide receiver class at the top, but there's a lot of guys that are kind of going to be like right on that day 2, day 3 kind of fringe where the Chargers can really maybe extract some value out of the class.
Yeah, I feel like Alex said pretty much everything. And, he mentioned Trey Harris. One of the guys that I liked that we'll get into, is his former teammate, Juice Wells. And he looked really good at Shrine. But, yeah, the first round isn't the place to be taking a wide receiver. And, we're talking that day 2 would be a sweet spot. Even potentially like day 3, I could see them just like taking a guy because they're going to have a lot of picks too. And like with this wide receiver class, it's kind of spread out. And, I definitely don't want to see them taking a wide receiver round 1, but that day 2, day 3, there are some guys, some sleepers in this class, people would say that I could see them taking, and then interesting to see what they do in free agency as well.
Yeah, famous Rutgers killer Pat Bryant will be available somewhere in the 3rd or 4th round. I've liked taking him in mocks just because I think his size kind of makes sense for them. I do think this is probably the depth class to go and get a guy in like early day 3 or kind of in on day 2, like you guys said. That's sort of the value, and we'll see what they do in free agency because that it kind of depends on that too, whether they're active on the trade market, how aggressive are they kind of let's go Keenan Allen aggressive, are they T Higgins aggressive, right? Like I think there's different ranges for what they could sign in free agency that then, obviously would contribute to their draft. The other question, and this has been the question since the Texans game where the Chargers offensive line got annihilated, for lack of a better term. How do we feel about them, I guess, addressing that in free agency and then building on that in the draft? Because I think we generally expect, right guard will be signed at some point in free agency. Do they bring competition for Zion Johnson as well? That's also a possibility, I think, to some extent, free agency. And then maybe, do you take a center / another guard in the draft? What do you kind of make of their stance as it is, today, sort of on how they approach the offensive line from here? And then who are some obviously good prospects from Senior Bowl and Tri Bowl that you guys noticed?
Yeah, I think that you're looking at them adding in total between free agency and the draft, probably 3 to 5 guys total, right? And that probably includes re-signing Bradley Bozeman if he does come back. But I would expect them to be more aggressive in the free agent market than in the draft. If you look at like where all of the top players at guard come from, most of them are signed as free agents. And so primarily, right, like these are players that teams let get to free agency. And so even if you don't sign a guy like Trey Smith, like a guy like Will Fries, who's probably like a top 20-ish guard in the league, is going to be available and will come a little bit cheaper, right? And then that frees up some money to sign maybe a guy like Ryan Kelly, who played with him in Indianapolis, to play center. But also you have to think about like Brendan Hymus is a free agent. Like Jamari Sawyer, I think, has 1 year left on his rookie deal. Your swing tackle is still Foster Sorrell, right? Like there's a lot of pieces that you can sort of add to in this room where you're going to need to add some depth. And especially with the way that we've seen the Chargers offensive line and really every offensive line in the league for the last few years handle injuries, right? Like you're going to have a stable of 8 or 9 guys that you really trust in order to make a run, right? And so again, like there's not necessarily a ton of guys like at the very top of the draft class that I'm in love with, but you look at the day 2, the day 3 talent in this class. At Shrine Bowl, I really liked Drew Kendall from Boston College, who's a center. He played a little bit of guard at Shrine Bowl too, and so like that sort of like Hymus-esque flexibility. He's not a similar player necessarily, but that sort of center guard flex ability that he has. Played in like a 2/3 gap scheme at Boston College. I talked to him for almost 15 minutes about like the way that scheme works. He's super detailed in his preparation and his understanding of that. Son of a former NFL player. I think that he makes a lot of sense kind of a little bit later down the draft. Thomas Perry at Middlebury, the D3 guard at Shrine Bowl, was fantastic. He played a little bit of center there as well. I think he'll probably get into the day 3 range with his performance. A guy like Marcus Weir at Montana State at Shrine Bowl was great. I think that he's probably a late day 3 type at guard. Someone like Gray Zabel obviously had a great Senior Bowl that is going to be more of like a top 2 round pick. I know like he's up to 26 or something on the PFF big board. I think maybe let's pump the brakes on that a little bit. I think that like, a lot of people are saying like, oh, you're not going to be able to get Gray Zabel past 40. I wouldn't say anything so definitively this early still. I would say, there's probably still a chance. The chance is certainly waning that he'll be available at 54, but like there's probably still a chance that he gets there. And then at Senior Bowl, a guy that I really liked, which is, probably not going to end up being a Chargers guy just because of how big he is, but Willie Lampkin is 5'10", 270, played guard and center at the Senior Bowl, was a late add from North Carolina, and was really, really impressive, especially for that size. I think, like he's not going to be a starter, right, in the NFL, but as a guy that can come in and provide some depth, provide a little bit of a mean streak. Like if he has to come in off the bench, like late day 3, that's someone that you can look at. Clay Webb at Jacksonville State is another sort of day 2, day 3 fringe guy that I thought played pretty well at the Senior Bowl. Again, some guard center flex there. So a lot of guys in this draft that like can play guard and center. And so when you're talking about adding depth behind some free agent possibilities, right? Like there's a lot of options, like all the way up and down this class.
Are we going to be there for the Willie Lampkin and Scott Matlock fullback competition?
Yes.
next
I think that's
summer?
definitely the move, right? Willie Lampkin UDFA signing, bring in some competition for Matlock. He might have to play a bigger role on the defensive line. Who knows?
Yeah.
One other guy I'll add, because I feel like Alex said everyone. I was going to say Drew Kendall. I really liked him. Alex, correct me on the pronunciation. Is it Cabledew or Cabledew?
Oh, yeah. I think it's Cabledew.
Cabledew. So he played primarily tackle at Kansas, but they kicked him inside to guard, and I thought he really stood out. So he would be good in like the run blocking scheme that the Chargers run. And again, we talked about having the versatility to play inside, outside. But yeah, he looks really strong on the interior. And, you know, we see Dominic Pooney last year get drafted, a guy that tackled a guard for the 49ers. I can kind of see him taking that same approach because I feel like he has guard size and he might be better along the interior, but he has that flexibility to play inside, outside. Like there's just a lot of guys that have that versatility that I think the Chargers will love. And he was one guy that really stood out to me at Shrine too.
I believe that this Cabledew person exists, but if I were to create a last name for a person that didn't exist that you were trying to skip by me, it might have been that one.
Yeah.
But I'll take a look into him at some point. I guess, okay, getting into we've talked about a lot of the wide receiver, tight end fits, talked about offensive line. This is the running back class. Obviously, we haven't seen many running backs in terms of like these all-star events really do much outside of like catch some passes, which Donovan Edwards, I guess, got some stock up in that regard. But where do you kind of see the Chargers in this running back class? I think there's kind of a group of Chargers fans who wants to take a running back, pretty early in this class, whether that is even Genty on day one, or, someone that is kind of in that round 1 to round 2 range amongst like the top 5 or 6 backs in this class. And then there's, the people like me who like to wait until day 3 and then find their back, especially in this class where I think, I've watched 13 of them at this point. And I do think there are a lot of running backs compared to previous years where you can kind of install a guy pretty easily into your offense relative to like, the last couple of drafts where I think you're, more dart throwing on day 3 compared to usual. So what do we make of this Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman run game? I guess a lot does depend on what they decide to do with Dobbins, also what they decide to do with Gus Edwards. But what do we kind of make of what they do in the draft and I guess the kind of back that they're looking for?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, right, like this is going to end as one of the better running back classes that we've seen in a really long time. A lot of people are comparing it to the CMC draft class, which I think is 2017, 2016, that, produced like 10 to 15 NFL contributors. I think that you're probably looking at a similar number, but not necessarily a similar level of impact from this class. I do think that like there's an argument to be made up and down this draft class, right? Where like if you want to take a guy like Amarian Hampton at UNC early, right? Like you want to even as early as 22, right? Like I get that. I get the desire to do that. He's a perfect gap scheme fit guy, which is what the Chargers are going to want to do. I totally get the compulsion to do that. I think there's a lot of guys that are going to be available on day 2 that make a lot of sense, right? Like someone like the Ohio State backs, right? Like Travion Henderson or Quinshon Judkins, I think make a lot of sense for what the Chargers want to do. I think, again, like you talk about the day 3 guys, I thought that like Brashard Smith was obviously very impressive as a receiver, as a converted wide receiver coming in. I thought that LaQuint Allen from Syracuse was really impressive at the Senior Bowl, right? Like, even like if you want to go like super late day 3, right? Like someone like Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt at Arizona was the MVP of the Shrine Bowl. He only played in 1 game in 2024 because of some eligibility issues that had nothing to do with anything that he did wrong. It was just like the NCAA doesn't know what their rules are anymore. Yeah. And so like there's guys up and down this list. Raheem Sanders, Rocket Sanders at South Carolina was at the Shrine Bowl. I thought he was super impressive. Showed a lot of like ability to run kind of outside the tackles that South Carolina and Arkansas didn't really give him the opportunity to show, right? And so, like, there's 20 guys in this draft class that I think you could point to and be like, that guy fits the Chargers, that guy fits the Chargers, that guy would have a role in the Chargers. Like, so up and down the draft, like, you can find anybody that can fit into this scheme, right? And again, not to, beat a dead horse with the Ravens analogy, right? But the Ravens have managed to find a lot of contributors on day 3 and in UDFA at running back, kind of over Joel Ortiz's tenure. They've also sort of tended to skew towards, if they're going to pick a guy, they're going to pick a guy pretty early, right? Like Dobbins was a 2nd-round pick. Gus Edwards was a UDFA, right? And so you kind of get that whole gamut, right? Where I think that there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of, like, there's a lot of flexibility with what the Chargers can do with this running back class. I think there's a lot of options, and that's a good thing, right? Because what it means is that when you get to 22, when you get to 54, when you get to the 3rd-round pick, right, you don't have to take a guy just because a guy is there. You can go BPA knowing that, like, hey, we're going to get to the 5th, 6th round, and a guy like Rocket Sanders or Khalil Mullings or someone like that is going to be available, right?
Yeah, one guy that I'll add to that list, Taj Brooks, also stood out at Shrine Bowl. So he kind of fits that physical, violent running style that Jim Harbaugh likes, can get, north-south quickly. Good in pass pro as well. So, again, it's a very deep running back class, and Alex was just listing names, but, I mean, that's just, like, a few. Like, we could keep going on, but, like, the Chargers will come away with the running back, and, this is the draft class to get one. But, they don't have to take one early necessarily, but you would get it if they did.
Yeah, I just felt like every time I turned on the all 22 for like a running back at this point, it was, oh, that guy like fits the Chargers. He could have like an immediate role. There was some like immediate, pop play that I just saw. There's a whole whopping like 6 minutes of Marcus Yarns, Penn State all 22, and here he comes, from the Senior Bowl. He just, returns one right to the house. So, I mean, this is like a pretty, I think, insane class athletically of just what these guys are able to do in terms of both fitting the scheme and then I think finding kind of your future, not necessarily running back one, but guy that, allows you to maybe transition out of the Dobbins era, depending on, how much longer they see him being the RB1 in this class. I guess what do we sort of see them doing with those two between Dobbins and Edwards, just to kind of like wrap up the offensive side of the ball here? Because I think we kind of expect Dobbins to be back on a pretty team-friendly-ish deal, just kind of based on his injury history. Definitely a pay bump from what he got this year. And then I think the real question is kind of Gus Edwards, who I think has gone under the radar. Obviously, the cap implications are they can save a couple $1 million by cutting him. That's how his contract was kind of set up last year. What do we sort of see them doing with both of those two guys and sort of restructuring their running back room prior to the draft?
Yeah, I think I would expect that they bring Dobbins back at a higher number than he was at last year, because if you look at the trajectory that he was on, right? Like, and obviously, like, this is always going to be part of the conversation with J.K. Dobbins is if he stayed healthy, right? But if he stayed healthy this season, he was on pace to easily be the Chargers' first 1,000-yard rusher since Melvin Gordon. And so I don't think that you let a guy like that walk, right? Like, I don't think you let him walk for nothing, right? And so I think you bring him back probably on another shorter term deal, maybe a 2-year this time, up the number a little bit to reward him for his performance, and you bring him back and let him sort of be the 1A. I think that, like, Kamani Vidal, I think, still has a role as a receiver, right? But, like, Gus Edwards, like, you save, I think, $4 million by cutting him this offseason. I think that that's probably something that just for cap, like, the Chargers don't need that $4 million necessarily, but at the same time, if they're going to be super aggressive in free agency, they might, right? And so, do you cut a guy like Gus Edwards and take a 2 that you're expecting to become a 1, right, in rounds 2 or 3 at running back in this draft class? I think that a guy like Hassan Haskins is pretty replaceable as like a goal line back that you give 4 carries every 2 weeks to.
We'll see how replaceable
yards.
We'll see how replaceable Jim Harbaugh thinks he is.
Yeah, well, like that's the beautiful thing about Khalil Mullings, though, right? Is that like it's
Yeah.
another Michigan running back that runs like 2 yards forward, but he's better at it than Hassan Haskins is. So like we're building the narrative here, Alex.
I know.
But yeah, like I think that like it, in that sense, right? Like there's still a lot of variables to be considered here, right? Where like if Gus Edwards doesn't get cut, right? If Gus Edwards stays on the team and they bring back J.K. Dobbins, then you're bringing back your top 3 guys at minimum, right? And so then it's like, okay, well, do you really want to bring in another guy that's going to have a big role? Like if you're paying Gus Edwards that much, right? Like, are you paying him that much to be an RB3? Really? Like that's kind of a, like a, to me at least, right? That's kind of a misallocation of resources. And so then you're probably looking at a day 3 or a late, UDFA type at running back to add to that room. Right. But, so there's a lot of stuff still to be determined because a lot of it is going to hinge on it's like what we talked about with the edge room, right? Where it's like a lot of it is just going to hinge on like what they do with the players they already have, because those are the top 2 guys in that room. And so based on what they do there, then you kind of adjust and you say like, okay, maybe we need to take a guy like Hampton early, right? And like add a dynamic element that's going to be like a 1B right away as a rookie, right? Or maybe we can sit back a little bit and we can take somebody like a Sanders or, a LaQuint Allen or something like that and, have that guy be a 2 or a 3 for a year or 2 and kind of work his way up the depth chart a little bit.
Yeah. Did you want to go, Gavino?
No, Alex said everything.
Yeah, I do like the idea of Trojan horsing Jim Harbaugh into cutting Hassan Haskins by getting him to get another Michigan back in either Mullings or Edwards in this class. So we'll see what kind of happens there. I guess we'll finish on this. General draft expectations as of now for the Chargers in the first round, and then like a little schematic of sort of how you see the rest of the rounds playing out.
Yeah, so go read my 3-round mock draft that I published yesterday.
There we go.
That's what they're
we can
do.
start there.
Good
but
plug.
I think that first round, right? Like you're looking at defensive tackle, tight end, corner, edge. Not necessarily in that order, but those are kind of like the positions that you're looking at, right? I think that you want to hit defensive line early. There's a lot of defensive tackles, a lot of edge rushers in this class. Like pretty much everybody has said like, I'm going to have 20 plus defensive linemen combined, right? In my top 50. Daniel Jeremiah has said that, like ESPN has said that, like everyone is kind of getting around to that sort of range, right? And so I think like by day 2, you want to have taken at least one defensive lineman. Whether that's a tackle or an edge doesn't really matter too much, right? But like you want to dip into the talent pool at that position. I think the same is true of tight end. By the end of day 2, you want to have dipped into that position group at least once, right? And then from there, right, it's sort of how the board falls, right? Do you want to take a corner because one falls to you at 22 and you love a guy like Revel? Do you want to take, a corner on day 2 that, someone that maybe we're talking about is like a top 40 guy where like Azaria Thomas could fall to 54, right? There's still a lot of time left to go here, right? And so if a guy like that gets there, do you take him at 54 and then sort of adjust? Do you take a wide receiver? Do you take a running back, right? Like I think that by, I would say round 4 or 5, right? I personally would want to hit tight end, defensive line in some capacity, maybe even both capacities, and running back, right? Depending, of course, on what they do with Dobbins and Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think from there, right, like wide receiver, we're going to have to see, right? I think you can mix a pick in there in the first 4 rounds, kind of depending on how the board falls, depending on what they do in free agency. Offensive line, kind of the same, where like I do expect them to be pretty aggressive in free agency on the offensive line. And so that sort of colors my perception of drafting an offensive lineman, where I think that a lot of the guys you're going to be drafting on the line are going to be depth players. I don't necessarily think you're trying to draft a starter, like a right-away starter, that is,
Right.
on the offensive line in this draft, because I think they're going to go out and spend a lot of money, right? And so, but by the end of the draft, like round, sometime day 3, right, you probably want to hit offensive line, because I think there's a lot of day 3 talent available in this class. And so when you kind of stack it up all like that, I think that there's still a lot of ways and there's still a lot of room for the Chargers to hit all of their needs, but I think it might come in a pretty different order than the way that people have been talking about it for the last couple of months.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like that's what happens when you're picking a little bit later too, and like the Chargers just have a lot of needs, but at the same time they don't, and a lot of it's going to free agency is going to play a role into that. See what they do. But like Alex said, coming away with the tight end, defensive tackle, edge rusher, in that capacity, like they have to, like before day 2 ends. And I think we saw that against the Texans. They struggled to get pressure. We saw Will Dissly drop passes too. So like these are positions that they absolutely need, that aren't going to be addressed in free agency, that are like must-haves like early on in the draft.
Yeah, I think the need for tight end there, obviously that'll hinge a lot on if Loveland is available there, if he's not, but I just think he is kind of the natural fit to this offense in the first round, where you sort of get that Ertz-like pass catcher where it's just kind of automatic, can run every route the book. And you saw, like Gavino said, the weaknesses against Houston, where Dissly, who is kind of supposed to be your C-gap blocker, have some, mild screen responsibility, is able to contribute to the offense, but should not be expected to be your, wide receiver tight end 1 level threat. And so I do think that is kind of why Loveland is like the automatic shoe-in fit, and then that allows you to play Dissly in a more suitable role for him, kind of as that tight end 2 that they originally signed him for. Obviously, that goes back to last year when they tried to sign Hayden Hurst and kind of expected a little bit more out of that signing. When they signed him on the minimum, didn't work out that way. And so I do think this is kind of the draft to aggressively get tight end. And then from there, I do think the defensive talent that you probably have to hit on day 1 and day 2, because, I don't know if I see a ton of avenues to them, like adding like premium defensive talent in free agency, aside from what we've already talked about, which is kind of like bringing Poona back, deciding what to do with the edge room. I think they're probably slightly more offensive minded in free agency, certainly. So then I think in the draft, you're probably supplementing that defensive talent early on. Any other final thoughts on the draft before we close out tonight, gentlemen?
I will say, and it's in the mock draft that I wrote too, but Kenneth Grant did tell at least one media member at the Shrine Bowl, that wasn't me, but I did hear it from the person that he did tell, that he would very much like to play for the Chargers. So Michigan defensive tackle, for anybody that doesn't know, probably going to be around the 22 range, might go a little bit earlier, but he is very much a fan of the coaching staff that came over from Michigan. Pretty much every single one of them down to the guy. Harbaugh mentor, defensive line coach Mike Elston. He's also pretty close with DB's coach Steve Clinkscale. And apparently he has family in LA. So something to think about, perhaps.
Yeah, and I feel like the one thing that I really took away from Shrine Bowl is tight end who I didn't mention, but Jalen Conyers. So I interviewed him. He was a standout performer, and he said that. So again, every player met with every team, but one thing that he said that really stood out is they said to him, the scouts said to him, the Chargers need a tight end. So they directly told him the Chargers need.
I forgot about that.
Tight end. So it's like, all right, so that's good to know. And then Kobe Bryant, the cornerback from Kansas. So he spent the second most time with the Chargers. The first was the Steelers. And again, Alex mentioned him earlier in the show. Feisty cornerback, a little bit on the thinner side at 171 pounds, but again, you have to have that dog in you at the cornerback position, and he showed that. He was talking trash the entire time, and it's like my type of corner right here.
Yeah.
And he can tackle too. So definitely need that in the cornerback room. Guys that can tackle.
Gotta be able to tackle, or he got put on
Gosh.
IR for the rest of the year. But that is an important skill set in this draft. So thank you guys for coming on. Great to talk about the draft and start breaking into our coverage a little bit there as we wet our feet as this NFL season ends on Sunday with the Super Bowl. So thanks to everybody for watching, and as always, bolt up and see you guys next time.